President Trump's claims about the Panama Canal, they've really stirred up some controversies, especially his assertions about the U.S. reclaiming it. And what makes this even more fascinating is how Panama's president, Laurentino Cortizo, has responded, directly refuting Trump's accusation. I mean, think about it for a second. The difference in power between those two countries is huge. So if you find yourself captivated by these kinds of global politics and the intricacies of international relations, well, then be sure to hit that like button down below and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into these fascinating topics. So Trump has made some pretty bold statements. He suggests that the U.S. should just take back the Panama Canal, and he even alleges that China is the one in control right now, which we know is just plain false. Then he goes on to make claims about how many Americans died during the canal's construction, way inflating the numbers, but he also suggests that U.S. vessels are being charged unfair fees to use the canal. Now, this discontent, it seems to come from a personal business dealing of Trump's, specifically the rebranding of the Trump Ocean Club International Hotel and Tower in Panama City, the one that ended up becoming a JW Marriott Hotel. What's really interesting here is that Panama's political stance is actually quite favorable towards the U.S. I mean, they actively work to push back against Chinese influence in the region. And you see this reflected in their score on the Freedom House rankings, that measure political freedom and civil liberties. They actually score pretty close to the U.S. So it makes Trump's accusations even more puzzling. Since Panama took control of the canal back in 1999, they've actually done a remarkable job managing it. Transit times have gone down, accident rates have decreased, and they even pulled off a major expansion project back in 2016, significantly boosting the canal's capacity. Even experts in the field pretty much agree that Panama's running the canal better than the U.S. ever did. Now, while those worries about Chinese influence in the area aren't completely unfounded, it's crucial to look at what's actually happening. Panama did have a brief stint with China's Belt and Road Initiative, that global infrastructure development strategy, and even hosted President Xi Jinping for a state visit. However, they've since backed out of that Belt and Road thing. And to top it off, the U.S. investment fund, BlackRock, is taking over ports that were previously run by a Chinese company, C.H. Hutchison Holdings. This move further reduces China's footprint in the region. But even with China's reduced presence, those potential dangers of them getting involved with the canal are still worth thinking about. See, those Chinese-operated ports could potentially become hubs for intelligence gathering. They could access ship manifests, which would give them valuable insights into global trade and even military movements. And they could even mess with containers or sabotage operations during a crisis, disrupting those vital supply chains and impacting global trade. This vulnerability that the canal presents for the U.S. is especially worrying if you consider a potential conflict in the Pacific region. To really grasp the current situation, it helps to look back at the history. The U.S. decided to give up control of the Panama Canal because holding on to it was becoming more and more unsustainable. Events like those 1964 student protests in Panama played a role too. They highlighted the growing tensions surrounding the U.S. presence. Even Henry Kissinger, a major player in U.S. foreign policy at the time, he saw continued U.S. control as pure colonialism. So let's shift gears a bit and look at those potential downsides of Trump's approach. His aggressive stance towards Panama, a much smaller and less powerful nation, it draws parallels to past U.S. interventions in Latin America, like the 1954 coup in Guatemala, where the CIA backed the overthrow of a democratically elected government. These interventions, often fueled by Cold War paranoia, they often backfired, creating resentment towards the U.S. and ended up benefiting adversaries like the Soviet Union during the Cold War. This historical precedent raises a big question. Could Trump's actions risk alienating countries in the Western Hemisphere and accidentally create opportunities for rivals like China? The historical parallels are definitely something to think about. Trump's rhetoric, it kind of reminds us of this pattern of U.S. intervention in Latin America, a pattern that hasn't always had the best results. Take the 1954 CIA-backed coup in Guatemala, for example. They ousted the democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz Guzman. This intervention, it was mostly driven by those Cold War fears about communism spreading, but it really just ended up fueling anti-American sentiment, destabilizing the region, and ironically, it gave the Soviet Union more chances to boost their influence in Latin America. So this historical example, it really highlights how Trump's approach towards Panama could backfire. By antagonizing Panama, a country that's already aligned with the U.S., and actively pushing back against Chinese influence, Trump risks pushing them further away and creating an opening for China to expand its presence in the region. It's almost like he's pushing a partner right into the arms of a rival through his aggressive words and actions. Just think about it for a second. If the U.S. through its actions alienates Panama, who really benefits, it's pretty clear China, a nation that's actively looking to expand its global footprint and challenge U.S. dominance on the world stage, would be the one to gain. And you see their ambitions on full display with China's Belt and Road Initiative, that massive infrastructure development project that's spanning across continents. Now, Panama did initially consider joining, but they ultimately pulled out, which shows they're sensitive to U.S. concerns and want to keep those strong ties with Washington. But this situation, it's not just about the Panama Canal. It's like a warning about the potential consequences of a heavy-handed foreign policy, one that relies on threats and coercion instead of diplomacy and mutual respect. When powerful nations like the U.S. U.S. resort to those tactics. They risk alienating potential allies and creating fertile ground for their adversaries to exploit. History is full of examples of U.S. interventions in Latin America that completely backfired, creating resentment and instability instead of achieving what they set out to do. From the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba to supporting those authoritarian regimes in Chile and Argentina, the U.S. has often pursued policies that ended up undermining its own interests and damaging its reputation in the region. The Panama Canal controversy is a stark reminder that navigating the global stage requires a delicate balance of strength and diplomacy. If the U.S. wants to hold on to its leadership position and counter the rise of rivals like China, it needs to be mindful of those unintended consequences of its actions and really work towards building strong, mutually beneficial relationships with other nations. This requires a deep understanding of history, respect for other nations' sovereignty, and a willingness to engage in dialogue and compromise instead of resorting to threats and intimidation. So, what can we take away from this deep dive into the Panama Canal controversy? It's a valuable lesson in just how complex global politics can be and how important it is to understand the historical context that shapes what's happening today. It underscores the need for a nuanced and strategic approach to foreign policy, one that prioritizes cooperation over confrontation and recognizes how interconnected everything is on the global landscape. This whole Panama Canal controversy really drives home this point. Global leadership, it requires a deep understanding of history, respecting other countries' sovereignty and a genuine commitment to working together instead of stirring up conflict. Actions that are fueled by personal grudges or just ignoring historical context, well, those can have some serious consequences. They can weaken those long-standing alliances and tip the scales of power towards our rivals. And the U.S., with all its power and influence, it needs to tread carefully and think ahead when dealing with other countries, especially in a region like Latin America, where historical sensitivities and the impact of past interventions, they continue to shape the realities of today. And the potential for unintended consequences, it's especially high in today's interconnected world. What happens in one part of the world can create ripples everywhere, impacting relationships and creating openings for our rivals to exploit. China, for example, with its growing economic and military power, they're actively trying to expand their influence all over the globe. And any missteps by the U.S. can give Beijing the chance to push their own agenda. The Panama Canal is a vital artery for global trade and a strategic choke point. It's a prime example of a place where Chinese involvement could have major consequences for U.S. interests. Panama's success in managing the canal since they took over in 1999, it really shows what they're capable of and their dedication to keeping this vital waterway neutral and efficient for global commerce. They focused on efficiency, investing in technology, and forming strategic partnerships. And this has allowed them to improve transit times, reduce accident rates, and even complete that major expansion project, solidifying the canal's role as a crucial link in the global supply chain. The contrast between Panama's success with the canal and the difficulties the U.S. faced when it was in control, it highlights how important it is to adapt to the changing global landscape and recognize the limits of acting alone. The U.S. decision to hand over control of the canal, even though it was tough at the time, it turned out to be the right move. It allowed for a more stable and mutually beneficial relationship with Panama and avoided the pitfalls of holding on to colonial control. This deep dive into the Panama Canal controversy has shown us just how complex global politics can be and how crucial it is to understand the historical context that shapes events today. It reminds us that global leadership, it takes more than just military power or economic strength. It demands a deep understanding of how interconnected the world is, a respect for other nations' sovereignty, and a real commitment to building relationships based on mutual respect and cooperation. If you found this exploration thought-provoking, be sure to like and subscribe for more deep dives into these complex global issues. And as you go about your day, consider this. Could similar actions by powerful nations lead to unforeseen consequences and opportunities for their rivals in today's geopolitical landscape?